Hi, folks. What's a debt trap and how can we get out of it? Join me. Hi, folks. Welcome to The Way I See It, which is my podcast on all things money, personal finance, investing, and how we can learn from all these topics. Yeah. This week, we're talking about the debt trap. And what is a debt trap? That's typically when you borrow and you actually make your repayments, but you don't pay enough to actually pay the interest portion of that loan for that compounding period. So what then happens is that interest is added back to your principal, and then you then get a vicious circle opening up where you're making payments, but you're not denting the loan balance per se. You're just paying, and every month the loan keeps on growing bigger and bigger, and before you know it, the interest now becomes larger than the principal itself, and then you're stuck in a place that you can't get out of. Yeah, so it's important for us to start from understanding what debt is. Debt is front-loaded consumption. When you borrow money, you're basically borrowing your future revenues today. And your idea is you're going to take those future revenues today, invest it with the hope of creating revenues today, right? That will then pay off revenues in future. You don't have to create the physical cash flow today, but you're laying the foundation to generate cash flow in the future that you will then use to pay off or cover that revenue gap that you've taken from the future. So when you borrow, you're consuming tomorrow's revenues today, and you want to basically invest to repay that revenue in the future. Easy enough, easy said. So what that tells us is basically there are just two types of debt. Good debt is debt that we can take, i.e., we can borrow our future revenues today, consume it today, and the revenues or the proceeds from that borrowing can repay the debt in future. So if we, for instance, borrow cash from a bank and we buy a house or like do a mortgage, more or less, yeah, the value of the house appreciates. And in a few years down the line, we then own a house or we basically are not paying rent. So we're covering up that expense that we're going to have in the future by making an investment today. That's a good debt, i.e., the return on investment, i.e., the value of the house is growing faster than the interest rate we're paying on the loan to buy the house. That's the mortgage. That can be called a good debt. What will be a bad debt? A bad debt will be where we borrow in from the future, i.e., we consume the future revenues today, but the returns we make cannot pay back what we have borrowed from the future, more or less. So, for it to think about, if I took a 1 million naira credit card debt to go on a holiday, summer holiday to say Athens, I get a good time, I've consumed that revenue in future today. But because it was a holiday, I did make no investment. So that gap still waits for me in the future. I have to pay back that 1 million that I've taken. I just have to pay it back. Either I increase my revenues today or I reduce my spending today, but eventually I would have to pay back that revenue I've taken from the future with no help from the funds I have taken because I consumed it, I did not invest it. So that's going to be a bad debt because the returns on that debt that I borrowed cannot meet the cost, which is the interest rate that's going to be charged me on the credit card to go on that holiday. So good and bad debt. Debt is not always bad. There's good debt, there's bad debt. We have to make sure that we're doing good debt, which is basically that the return that we're going to get is going to be higher than the cost we're going to pay. But I want to get into more specifics on this debt trap. I think there are three main things that we should understand about debts, three main concepts that if we do understand them and how they interrelate, it will help us in avoiding debt traps and in being better stewards of our money. The first is going to be our credit scores. Yeah. The next is going to be what's called the annual percentage rate, the APR. The last is going to be what we call negative compounding, your negative compounding. Yeah. Now, let's start with the credit scores, or what we normally call the FICO, the Fair Isaacs Credit Organization, the FICO score, what we call the FICO score. Now, a credit score is just a numerical expression of how reliable a borrower is. So if you have a FICO score of, say, 800, that's a high score. And what that means is that creditors consider you to be a good borrower. What's a good borrower? A good borrower pays back. So FICO scores can go from 350 all the way to 800. And the difference is that the higher your score is, the better. So if you have a higher score, that means you've borrowed in the past and you've paid back on time with no derogatory remarks on you, and you kept your credit usage very, very low. You kept that usage of credits very, very low. That gives you high marks. So if you have a high credit score, you are able to borrow money at a lower interest rate than someone that has a lower credit score. So the better you are a borrower, the lower the cost of you will borrow from banks and credit institutions. So the first thing is the credit score. And for credit scores, we want to get a high credit score. And that's going to go from 350 all the way to 850. We want to get the higher, the better. The second concept is going to be the APR, i.e., the annual percentage rate of a loan. So when you borrow, normally people hear interest rate. Interest is just the cost of the loan itself. But what about the fees? What about the taxes? What about the other things that are tacked on to the loan that are not part of the interest cost per se? That's what APR does. APR allows you to capture the total cost with fees, fines, management fees, all captured in that loan. You are then able to compare APR to APR and tell if this loan is cheaper than next because you're comparing like for like. A bank could charge you 5% interest rate, and the other bank could charge you the same 5% interest rate, but with a management fee of 10% over the year of the loan. But the APR will capture both. It will capture the fees and the interest cost. So when you compare both banks, you will see that the guy charging you the 5% interest rate plus the 10% management fee has a higher APR. So APR is just the cost of the loan, right? When an APR, of course, want to get a lower APR, that helps us to basically manage the debt. So we're talking about the credit scores, we want to get a high one, and we'll talk about the APR, which we want to get to be lower. The last concept is going to be negative compounding. We all know what compounding is. That's interest on interest. And we talk about the positive effects of compounding all the time. We say Albert Einstein said compounding was the eighth wonder of the world. That is true only if it's positive. So you invest 1 naira today, you get 2 naira. The next day you get 4 naira. You get 8 naira. You get 16.32. So it's compounding positively. Your returns are being reinvested. The way you can look at compounding is if you buy a share and it pays you a dividend and you reinvest your dividend back to buy more shares. You're compounding your returns. That's a very, very good way to grow wealth. You're reinvesting the returns you get to grow the base and invest more principal to then get more interest going forward. But what about negative compounding? When you're doing negative compounding, it's basically the reverse of compounding, in which case you borrow a thousand, say $1,000, and your interest is 10%. And there's a fee of 10% if you don't pay on time. Now, let's say you miss a payment. The fee gets tacked back onto the principal. So right now you no longer owe 1,000, but you owe 1,100, and you're going to pay the interest of 10% on 1,100. So you can see that negative component, it has increased what you owe, not really because you borrowed the extra 100, but because of a fee or a tack on. You then have a larger principal that you got to pay back on. So negative compounding is the positive side of compounding, but the reverse, whereby your debt is basically just increasing exponentially, not because you are borrowing, but still because the interest you have not paid is being tacked back on to the principal of the loan. So when you add all these three concepts, the credit scores, the APR, and the negative compounding, you then have a picture of why people get into a debt trap. What normally happens is that if you have a lower credit score and you want to go borrow money, you'll be given a loan at a higher APR because your credit score is lower. And that then forces or puts more pressure on your ability to repay. And when you have more pressure, you're more liable to miss a payment. You miss a payment, you then get a fee tacked back into your principal. You then have a negative compounding. So you then have that circle basically starting off, in which case you have a higher principal to pay at a higher APR, which then damages your credit rating. If you want to then do a refinance, it then gives you at a higher rate, which then gives you more pressure to pay back. And of course, you then get more negative compounding. This is what happens most times to countries and also happens to personal balance sheets. Most of the countries you see, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, that have a huge debt burden, they did not borrow that amount of money. They did borrow a little bit of the principal, but negative compounding fees, penalties, all that add back up and has blown up the debt picture to an unsustainable level, which can never be paid back without help because they just did not borrow that amount. The country cannot pay. Usually, but the negative compound has ballooned those debts to unrealistic levels. So that's the problem, really, that you then have yourself in a situation whereby you have 10 lines of credit and you cannot pay. So now that we've understood what good debt and bad debt is, and then the factors that can lead us into negative compounding, how can we get out of a debt trap? How can we approach a debt? Let's give an example now. Let's say we have Cola, and Cola has three credit cards. One has $1,000 on it at 10%. The other has a $2,000 on it at 20%. The other has a $3,000 balance on it at 30%. So it's easy for us. 1,000, 10%, 2,000, 20%, 3,000, 30%. So he has these three credit cards. There are two main ways Caller can pay off his credit card. The first is can do the snowball effect, and the next it can do the avalanche effect. When you're doing the snowball effect, just like a snowball going down the hill, you are going after the lowest amount first. So you're going after the lowest amount first. So in Collar's case, he has a 1,000, a 2,000, and a 3,000 credit balance on his credit card. He's going to try to pay off, first of all, the minimum on all the cards. Then any excess he has, he's going to target the $1,000 credit card. It has the lowest balance. He wants to pay that off so he can pay that off his books quicker. So the advantage to him is simple. He can pay it off and get a quick win. He sees his debt reduced from three credit cards to two credit cards because he's going to target that $1,000 credit card, pay it off, so he feels good about what he's done. That's the advantage. The disadvantage is, of course, because he's just paying off the amount, not the APR, which is the cost of the loan. He might not be saving money. The loan with the highest interest rate I've shown, this example, is the $3,000 credit card because it has a $30% APR, but it's paid on 10% APR. So yes, he pays off the debt. It reduces his number of lines, credit lines reduce, but his cost is still going to be high. So that's the advantage and the disadvantage of the snowball effect. What about the avalanche effect? When you do the avalanche effect, you're paying off the balance with the highest APR first. So in our example, that we have the 10%, the 20%, the 30% APR. So Caller is going to pay off the 30% APR credit card first because it's the most expensive. And so he pays off, he makes his minimum payments for 1,000, for 2,000, for 3,000. Then takes the excess or his savings and he targets the $3,000 credit card because it has a 30% APR. The advantage of this is very, very clear. He's paying off the expensive card, so he saves more money. The disadvantage is that he might not see instant gains because you see here he has to pay off 3,000 before he pays off 1,000. So it might take longer for him to get that done. But he's seeing his gains in terms of his cash flow reducing because he's targeting the card that has the highest APR. So whichever method you want to use, the snowball or the avalanche, they both serve the same purpose. They give you a planned way to pay off debt. You can have all this debt. It gives you a planned way. It's better this way than just paying off at will. I personally prefer the avalanche method because you're paying off cash flow. You're focusing on cash flow. If you pay off the expensive debt, you're increasing your cash flow more or less. So I personally favor the avalanche, but both of them do try to achieve the same objective. So what do you then do when you're faced with a debt profile? Like you have a lot of debt all over the place. The first thing you do is you organize your debt, list everything out, write what you owe, who you owe it to, the amount, the APR, get all the information, list them all out. Then you can arrange them. You can arrange them by amount or by APR. Just get them all arranged in one place. Decide what strategy you want to use. Are you going to do avalanche What are you going to do? Snowball. That's your second thing you're going to do. Then the third thing you want to do is you want to call your creditor before you start to pay and say, hey, can you guys give me a deal? If I paid now, will I get a reduction in my interest rate? Or would you guys write off a part of my loan? Will it affect me if you guys write off my loan? Will it show up on my credit score? Try to call and see if you can get a deal. Most creditors will give you a deal if you're ready to pay cash or if you're ready to do a payment plan. So call and see if you can get a better deal than what you have right now. Make sure you call. You might never know. They might be doing a program that you're not aware of and you get a good deal. So call and get if you can get any deal on how to pay back this debt. Then once you have done that, then basically start a budget. So create your budget. If you're doing the avalanche, you know you're going to be paying the high cost debts first. Make a provision for that. Reduce some of your expenses. Create the rest into your budget, into your debt payback plan, and start to pay back. Create your budget. Reduce your spending. Take the excess you've saved from no longer spending and pay down your debt. Remember, in personal finance, the only guaranteed return you make is if you pay off a debt. If you pay off a debt, it's a guaranteed return because you have grown that portfolio by the amount of debt you've taken off. So focus on your debt. If you have the choice between making a debt repayment and investing, as long as the investing return is not the only investment place where only invest where the returns on that investment is higher than the debt you are paying. If you are owing and you have a chance to invest, compare the cost of the debt and the return on the investment. If the cost of debt is higher, make sure you pay the debt down before you go and invest. Very, very important. All right, guys. So just to summarize, a snowball, an avalanche, FICO, credit negative amortization, APR, we have to know this and have to know how it works so that we can apply them to our own personal finance. We'll stop here, guys. Thank you so much for listening. Do follow on Twitter, FinPlanCarlo@one. Keep sending your questions. I appreciate you sharing and subscribing to the podcast. I really do. I'm going to leave you guys here for the week. I'll see you all next week. Stay safe out there, guys. Bye.